Welcome to this edition of Business and Society. I'm John Palusek, host of the program. Tragically, millions of people around the world not only do not share in the many benefits of our globalized modern society, they are actually exploited within it. They are the unfortunates, children as well as adults, who are still enmeshed in circumstances that cry out for attention and for redress. In 2011, the United Nations generated such attention, and it was hoped action, when it published its far-reaching, quote, UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, unquote. On this edition of Business and Society, we report on the efforts made by socially responsible companies, individually and in cooperation with concerned non-governmental organizations and governments in addressing these issues. For this report, we've invited leaders of two organizations that, well before the UN Guiding Principles and subsequently, have worked to improve the human rights of many people and communities in the globalized business supply chain. The Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility has, for more than 40 years, acted as a coalition of active shareowners who view the management of their investments as a catalyst to promote justice and sustainability in the world. It comprises nearly 300 organizations, including faith communities, socially responsible investment management firms, universities, pension funds, and unions. The General Electric company, GE, the renowned 130-year-old technology company with annual revenues of about $150 billion and some 300,000 employees worldwide, hardly needs an introduction. However, GE has also long been recognized for embedding sustainability into its culture and its business strategy. Its human rights policies for GE employees include non-discrimination, prohibitions against child and forced labor, freedom of association, and the right to engage in collective bargaining. Reverend David Schilling is the Senior Program Director at ICCR on Human Rights and Resources. Mark Nordstrom is Senior Labor and Employment Counsel at GE and leader of the company's human rights initiatives. Welcome, David and Mark.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Gentlemen, let's start by framing this discussion on human rights, because the term human rights is quite broad. What are the major issues and challenges and subject matter within that perimeter of the term human rights? How does ICCR come at it? How does GE come at that kind of prioritization of the agenda, as it were?
Well, first, it's so critical to be involved and engaged with communities around the globe. At ICCR, it's faith-based. Members have partners all over the world. So first, it's important not to decide what the human rights issues and violations may be in communities, but rather to be in touch with communities. Mm-hmm. And some of those are very clear. We've worked in the extractive industry, for example, as share owners in a range of mining companies, oil extractive companies. Lots of communities have said to us through partnerships that when, for example, a mine might expand, communities need to be engaged and involved with that process, because it may mean displacing people. It may mean that the expansion might pollute the water, and it may mean health issues for children in the near term.
It's communities as well as individuals.
That's right. It's individuals as well as communities. And I think when Professor John Ruggie went through the process at the UN that ended up with the UN Guiding Principles, mm-hmm. he decided, and I think rightfully so, that the full range of human rights is what we're talking about. And that's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's the economic, social, cultural rights, as well as the political, sort of the freedom, the sort of impersonal freedom, freedom of association, et cetera. So we shouldn't decide, okay, which rights? I think it's the full range of rights. And certain sectors, there's more impact in a community by, let's say, Newmont Mining in Peru than there is with H&M in Bangladesh, even though there are impacts that affect human rights.
Yeah. How does it play out at GE, Mark?
Well, it's exactly as David was saying. There are lots of human rights that are more salient to one business versus another. So, for example, at GE, you might have an appliance business where supply chain is going to be a huge issue and involve child labor, forced labor, those types of rights that you would find in typical supply chain analysis. An energy business where if you have a large infrastructure footprint, you're going to be looking at rights around indigenous people, land use, environmental, and so forth. Our healthcare business, in some respects, addresses a human right there. But of course, one of the human rights that they would have to be cognizant of is privacy. Likewise, we have a water business. Water is a human right, or access to water is a human right. So when you think about the scope of GE businesses and its diversity, each one of the businesses needs to understand the full, for simplicity purposes, we talk about the Declaration, Universal Declaration of Human Rights that has 30 rights articulated. You have to think of them all, but there's going to be a sweet spot of rights tied to the particular activities of a given business.
And what has happened since the 2011 UN Guide and Principles? Have there been initiatives? Has there been greater emphasis or perhaps even identifiable progress that we can talk to?
I think so. We can't underestimate the impact of having a kind of an emerging new global norm that helps define and gives guidance to the role of business and human rights. I think our work as faith-based investors, SRI firms, in companies, we filed resolutions to get companies to adopt codes of conduct around human rights, whether it was for the supply chain or more of a comprehensive human rights platform. But those were more sort of company-specific, sometimes sector-specific. Now we have a global norm. I think the change then is, yes, companies like GE, others that have been involved in the process are now into the implementation phase. So we're beginning to see that happen. And I think my view is that the challenge now is to move beyond the few global companies that have really been a part of and endorsed and really are implementing the guiding principles to the small size enterprises in all over the world. And there are initiatives doing that. The Global Business Initiative on Human Rights is really reaching companies in emerging markets that haven't been a part of the global discussion. So I think it has a tremendous potential, hasn't been realized yet, but a tremendous potential to give guidance to a very small company who may not face all of the challenges of a large global company, but has responsibilities. It's the corporate responsibility to respect human rights that's now the norm, as opposed to, states, that's state obligation.
It sounds as if that is indeed what's been happening increasingly.
I think actually for many countries, certain companies, certainly GE, it started before that. Once John was appointed as special representative for business and human rights, he didn't waste any time. So in 2006, we first met John when we joined an organization called BLEAR, the Business Leaders Initiative on Human Rights. And we as a US company, not particularly well schooled in human rights at the time, thought it wise, based on input from organizations, stakeholders like ICCR, to kind of get up to speed quickly. And the way to do that for us was to join this organization. Where in Boston, I met John early in 2006, and that's when we began to focus primarily on human rights. And there was a reason for it, and the reason was we were going to be expanding in emerging markets where human rights are under pressure. And rather than simply go to these emerging markets and run into problems that we hadn't really thought about, we felt it was important to try to get some early teachings.
Emerging markets, however, that leads to an interesting area as well, because it goes to the business case for being responsible in this respect. And obviously, ICCR has investors as a very central constituency.
That's correct.
And GE speaks of creating additional shareholder value in this connection as well. So there is kind of a common denominator in terms of the importance of the investor in this commitment, et cetera. How does creating additional shareholder value fit into this discussion?
Well, socially responsible investors like David's organization are certainly one of the shareholder value equations or inputs that you want to be cognizant of. Yeah. But I think more broadly than that, what we're trying to do at GE is make money, make it ethically, and make a difference. And many of the products that we have, we think, respond to the issues of individuals and people at the bottom of the pyramid in some of these emerging markets. So our products, as I mentioned, water, energy, healthcare, particularly respond to those issues. If we want to produce and sell products in companies that are in the emerging markets, we have to do it in a way that doesn't, put our reputation on the line. So we want to sell those products, we want to sell them in the emerging markets, and we want to do it in a way that keeps GE known throughout the world as an ethical, responsible citizen.
And then there's the Eco-Imagination commitment as well.
Correct.
That is the backdrop, perhaps.
I think we're up to about $25 billion worth of products that are part of the Eco-Imagination equation. Mm-hmm. And these are products that can be used worldwide in a way that's more sustainable than products of the past. And so Jeff always likes to say, green is green. And we've never made any bones about the fact that we believe that making products that are green will ultimately, in the long run, prove to be a good value for the shareholder.
But David, your constituency seems to be centrally placed in the socially responsible investing community. Is the socially responsible investment community growing? And are you, in a sense, benefiting from the kind of commitments you're getting from those people?
Yes, it's growing, and I think we're benefiting as well. But I think if you look at sort of assets under management that are socially responsible, in the 80s it was probably about 80 billion. Now it's close to 4 trillion. And that's calculated through a variety of screens as well as active engagement of companies. But I think no question that that's building. And I think part of it is mainstream investors are now seeing investment in companies and other products through a lens of environmental, social governance issues. The ESG has really been elevated, and the UN Principles on Responsible Investment is now a group of members. Some of our members are members of the UNPRI, but it's bringing in some of the mainstream, larger pension funds, asset management firms to begin for the first time to look at human rights criteria for their investments. And I think, that helps.
And you're using a couple of different screens, aren't they? Positive and negative screens?
That's right.
In that regard?
That's right.
How does that play out?
Well, a negative screen, it depends on the institution. ICCR doesn't sort of dictate that to our members. They have their own screens, but a negative screen would really be looking at a sector. It may be, for some, oil and gas. It may be tobacco. It may be, weapons. Mm-hmm. It may be a whole range of things. It may be companies that have, over time, had really a negative record on the environment, or on human rights or child labor. Yeah. So the negative is really not putting your money in. The positive is, okay, here are companies that are taking leadership, and we want to reward that. Mm-hmm. And as a result, I think there's that drive to encourage companies to take into account human rights, social sustainability, environmental sustainability issues as a part of their core business, not as an add-on that is, good in terms of maybe volunteerism or philanthropy. It's really at the core of the business. Yeah. And I think that's the exciting piece. And I think now there's an opportunity for sort of mobilizing more of the traditional funds to weigh in on the side of, well, human rights, okay, it may start as it's good risk management, but then you begin to see it's not just risk, it's the opportunity to build more sustainable communities where the consumer base grows, et cetera. And that's
So the mainstream investor is getting much more interested in this.
yes. Not
Mark-
there
Mark-
yet, but more interesting.
Mark, are you seeing something like that at GE as well? And also with your employees, perhaps, and your customers, that kind of sentiment in terms of approaching the relationship with GE?
Yeah, I think it used to be that civil society was kind of in a name and shame mode, and I think back in 2000, early 2000, mid 2000, there's been a greater level of dialogue and collaboration between pointing out, educating corporations about some of the sensitivities that just weren't there, and corporations were listening and are still listening. We've got a long way to go. I'm not saying that things are perfect, but I think the alignment of civil society and corporations has really taken off. And it's needed too, because certainly some governments are more protective of human rights than others. And where we are going throughout the world, we may not have governments that are quite as protective. And so having the allegiance, having the working together collaboration of civil society and corporations is a huge benefit in terms of the direction we're going in the human rights and business game.
And I think, Mark, one good example of that, recent example, which I think you have really addressed in other programs, is the Bangladesh situation, where fire issues, killing workers, collapsed building. Now you have an accord that has well over 80 companies working with trade unions, civil society, and really putting together an inspection plan, total transparency of what's taking place, and the opportunities not just to deal with fire safety and health, but other human rights issues in terms of wages, working conditions, to restructure, in effect, to make the apparel industry in Bangladesh much more in line with human rights criteria.
And does this work in other issues as well? Child labor, trafficking?
Human
et cetera?
trafficking is a great
Please,
example.
yes.
No, human trafficking is a huge issue globally, and one of the problems with, just like human rights, it's a term that is broad and difficult to define, because it can be everything from migrant workers to child labor to sex traffic, so it covers a lot of turf. Which is a little bit of a problem. However, the needs are so great, and I think that even our own government, in terms of the executive order for federal contractors, to have a policy and practices that address human trafficking, is illustrative of the fact that people are throughout the world understanding this is something that we have to come together to resolve.
The question of the terrible unemployment rates, especially in less developed countries, and most especially in terms of the younger generation, is that within the periphery of the human rights discussion?
Well, I think it has to be. No matter where you are in this world, the U.S. or anywhere else, job creation, education, and health care for the youth, all of those things are very, very important. And we've all got to do our part, because the problem is only worsening, and it's not going to be one that's solved by any single corporation or any government or any element of civil society. It really requires us all to be coming together. There are some basic elements, I think, of infrastructure that's necessary for, like energy, for job creation to occur, whether it's in Nigeria or in Myanmar. And so some of these products that GE has and that other corporations have are necessary in order for job creation and giving the youth education and jobs.
And I think this it's a critical point to look at if you're dealing with human rights issues directly. For example, a broad coalition of faith-based organizations, human rights groups, trade associations working to change forced child labor by the government of Uzbekistan in the cotton fields. So for 4 years, we've had a broad coalition, government, state, we look at trade unions, labor, investors, et cetera. And if we're successful there, working through the International Labor Organization, having 120 companies say they're not going to knowingly source from Uzbekistan, you're actually helping to create jobs. Because right now it's children who schools are closed, go to the fields, not being paid. Those are jobs that should be well paid, and adults should be doing them. So I think there's an interrelationship of creating a framework as we look at specific issues like forced child labor, which is an egregious violation, and making it possible for fair wages to be paid in an industry if it can restructure itself with the help of the international community.
We only have a few more moments, but David, it's not just filing proxy resolutions. Sometimes it's meeting with companies, and sometimes there's a long time process in terms of getting some action. How does that play out?
The shareholder resolution is an important sort of getting the door open. The votes are important because the other shareholders know what the issues are and can vote, but it's only one avenue. I mean, more and more, we are meeting with companies, engaging with top management without the need for a shareholder resolution. Why? Because the door is open. And if emerging issues are there, whether it's trafficking and slavery or issues around food, around water, the human right to water, there may be a need. But often, when it's open, if you're dealing with the right people in the companies and you sort of look at it from here we are now, let's take this awareness of the issue, let's move to action goals, put in place policies that'll address this to not only protect the rights of people but protect the company as well.
Just to cap off this discussion, because we are running out of time, Mark, what do you think is the future, the velocity and the direction of CSR and sustainability among corporations these days and on into the future?
Well, I think the tipping point is past. Okay, particularly as you mentioned with John Ruggi's report. What we need to do is get this seep down to smaller, mid-sized corporations. I mean, we have the girth, if you will, to devote time and effort on this, but there are other organizations, other business entities that do not have the type of backbone and resources to really focus in on this. So somehow we have to make this digestible and implementable, if you will, at a level within all of the corporations throughout the globe. And that's a huge task.
A huge task. Thank you so much for coming, David and Mark.
Thank you.
Really
Thank you.
very, very interesting.